Sadly, we have to meet under these conditions. I really had preferred being there physically, but it is what it is. So my topic this evening or this afternoon is on sustainable construction in Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm currently at the Mona campus here. And this study was done whilst I was there in St. Augustine. According to a report by the World Bank, you found that in 2012, there was a global collective of 1.3 billion tons of solid waste every year. Now, this has drastically increased and will continue to increase to 2.2 billion tons annually by 2025, according to the same report. Now, building material comprises of half of this entire solid waste generated every year. And as we know, the construction industry is one of the worst industries for waste generation. We consume more than any other before. And so there's 17 sustainable development goals which have been developed by the UN and otherwise. And there is a thrust towards revamping the entire globe where this is concerned. This study finds itself most applicable to number 11, but a number of others also, but number 11 in particular, looking at sustainable cities and communities and how we can try and advance that thrust as well. Now, Trinidad and Tobago is fortunately a signatory to a number of different sustainable development thrust, conventions, protocols, agendas, linking also to climate change and environmental conservation, leading to sustainable construction. So it's not lagging behind documentation-wise. However, in spite of these positive steps, there's still some constraints when it comes to sustainable construction in Trinidad and Tobago. And there's still a lack of research as it pertains to the current state and the way forward. How can we implement or transform the issue from just a policy into practice? The constraint is not just in Trinidad, this is actually a global phenomenon still to date. And one of the other issues that the specific challenge experienced by developing countries similar to Trinidad and Tobago is the scarcity of resources allocated to sustainability. And of course, to aid in this development, there was a Agenda 21 thrust for sustainable construction in developing countries, which looked at Caribbean, but a large aspect of the study was in the African continent and Pacifics and many other such developing countries. So drawing on all of that, we can move forward as well. So what we've also noted is that sustainable construction is still an emerging field, as even the term itself and this thrust towards sustainable development only occurred in around the 1980s and has been picking up traction since then, but still a very slow moving and slow developing field as well, and even more so in the construction industry. We are known to be one of the slowest moving industries for change. If you take concrete, for instance, it's very old material and rarely have we developed anything new as we proceed, but there is some shift in that direction going forward, as the previous presenter had tried to allude to. While the foundation of knowledge in the field is continuously expanding, as mentioned before, sustainable construction is still yet standard industry practice, and it may take some time for that to happen, and we can see why as we proceed. The aim of the study was to explore the perceptions of key project participants in construction industry towards sustainable construction in Trinidad using the same development Agenda 21, as I mentioned before, to create a framework by which to identify the major barriers to sustainable construction, the drivers, enablers, and what actions can be done in order to make this an implementable practice. And thus the main objective was to identify the highest ranking barriers, enablers, drivers, and actions involved in the implementation of sustainable construction in Trinidad. The methodology used in this study was quantitative in nature. It incorporated the use of 42-item survey questionnaire. All questions were a 5-point Likert scale in base, and the results would have been mainly focused on descriptive statistics and central tendencies, looking mainly at the means and thereby developing the ranks in that context. Approximately 750 questionnaires were distributed across the industry to major project participants, and the response rate was approximately 20%, with 154 respondents providing full responses. More came in, but some of them had to be rejected. These were all the viable options that were used in the study. The questionnaire was distributed to clients and developers. These were mainly on the government side, looking at special purpose companies and such likes. We also had the designers being a part of it. So we have the different associations. So we have the APET, that's the Trinidad and Tobago Professional Engineering Association. We also had the Contractors Association, the PMI persons related to the field, and the land surveying, the surveying association as well. So all different disciplines were involved, and direct and indirect contacts were used via emails as well as who you could meet face to face. What we had was, results-wise, was a fairly equal distribution of the respondents across the study. And what we also had was a fairly high Cronbach alpha, looking at the reliability of the instrument used, and each sub-area would have had a Cronbach alpha above 0.7, which is what is seen commonly used in the literature. And overall, it had a Cronbach alpha of 0.9. So we could believe the results to be of great value. Now, as I mentioned before, we looked at the top ranking initiatives, and what we had seen were the top 5, which are highlighted in yellow. So as we go through them slowly, we look at common issues. Now, as is the case with many studies, funding is normally the issue. And in this case as well, funding is one of the #1 barriers to its implementation of construction development. Second to that would be the initial costs of investment. So once again, a financial issue. And third would be the legal framework. Now, as is the case with many countries, the government, it has to be the #1 driver. It is oftentimes the #1 client. Approximately 70% of the projects taken on in most countries are taken on by the government. And so if the government who's in the driver's seat doesn't actually change the legal framework to make this a positive initiative, then it's less likely you will find much transformation taking place. One of the other issues we found was the culture of the staff. Now, again, naturally, if the government has this issue, there's less incentive or motivation on the part of the staff members and the industry to make this transformation. For the project managers, they identify that as the #1 issue, that the culture of persons to buy into these concepts, to change the practices, it's a very slow moving process. But what we also saw was the lack of knowledge being a part of it. Now, this was somewhat strange when you look at the developers. They're suggesting that they're fully aware, i.e. the clients are aware of it, and it seems to be the design team and the project managers who seem to lack knowledge of sustainable construction and, I guess, sustainable practices as well. And so there's clearly a need for an education amongst this group in order to be able to educate the client or push initiatives forward for the client to implement to bring about the change that we're speaking of. Looking at the drivers, so having looked at the barriers, now we look at the drivers towards sustainable construction. The #1 driver, which is agreed by all parties, is the reduction in cost to construction, operation, and maintenance. So if it is that the sustainable construction are implemented, we should see a reduction in costs across the board, but what we also see is an improvement in quality of the final product. And third, we also see an increase in speed. Now, if we look closely, you realize that this ties back with the triple constraints on projects, which is oftentimes tied to project success: time, cost, quality. And it said that if these three are used in tandem and moving together in a positive way, then it should have a positive impact upon the project. And we're seeing all participants in agreement with that context as well. What we're also seeing as a possibility, as was mentioned in a previous presentation, or the question was asked, was the creation of a new market. So if we move towards sustainable construction practices, maybe transformation in the materials, as the previous presenter had looked at fiber and things of that nature, then there may be spin-off aspects here. Materials which would have been going to the landfills as waste could now be used as some income generating opportunity as well. What this may also present is an advantage over competitors. This is the case we see in the developed countries, such as the UK, where they use key performance indicators. And when you put these things as indicators for one to be awarded a project, then it becomes an incentive for many to move in this direction and, of course, play a part, because now they could get a project over their competitor just by simply implementing these things. Now, what we see is that the enablers are directly tied to the barriers. So what may enable the transformation? #1, again, review and updating of existing policies and legislations and regulations. So if we change the framework, the legal framework, the policies that drives and governs the overarching thing, then we may find the push towards that transformation needed. The other thing we see is that it also promotes innovation and use of more sustainable practices through financing. So if the government once again wants to promote, maybe through the tender evaluation phase, maybe through other phases such as value engineering in the project, they could see that transformation taking place. What we also found is that the knowledge sharing amongst researchers, educators, and construction industry stakeholders is lacking. But if it is that takes place, we may find a transformation. Historically, this has been a challenge in the industry. We're not known for sharing as much, partially because the belief is by withholding this knowledge, the knowledge is seen as power, then now I'm in a position of advantage over my competitors because I know something that they don't. But then we realize that your competitor also knows something that you will never learn if you don't share. So we have to change that focus and now get to that avenue. What we also see is the need for the change in the curriculum and the training programs at the various educational institutions. And so the university is very poised in its bachelor's and master's programs to push sustainable development, sustainable practices as a course and other things to get that transformation that is necessary in the minds of all of the players across the spectrum. Last but not least, we have cooperation and partnerships between researchers and developing countries of other developing countries. So right now we seemingly live in a bubble. Yes, we may look at the papers of other countries, but rarely do we find ourselves engaging directly unless it's in a conference environment such as this, where we can share ideas and be able to look at stronger partnerships and things of that nature. Last but not least, we look at what actions could be done or should be done to make this a reality. The number one is provide monetary and fiscal incentives and disincentives. So one has to...
Sorry, Dr. Ellis, just...
Yes, time?
Just if you can wrap up in a minute, that'll be great.
Sure. There are just 2 more slides.
No problem.
Yeah. So what we see is that as long as we look back at the monetary aspects, so provide monetary aspects, this is a government initiative. We see revising the policy, once again, the government, providing funding, the government. So most of the actions needed has to be driven by the government, but we in the private sector also have to, and academia, have to push the government in the direction that they need to go. So in conclusion and quick recap, what we see is that in order to enable the advancement, there is an opportunity to enable advancement of construction industry through the transformation of policies, legislation, and regulations. And this should be promoted through finance initiatives. But we also see opportunities and challenges that exist. And if it is that we work together, we can make the transformation needed. And these are a few references, and thank you very much. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Dr. Ellis. Just one question we have with respect to your presentation. How valid is your descriptive statistics using the Likert scales where the data are ordinal? Are there any assumptions for the analysis?
Yes, the ordinal scale is oftentimes an issue with Likert scale. The literature is split on this in regards to its use in that context, but it doesn't impact negatively. What it simply means is that we can't use it in a parametric approach, but more so a non-parametric approach to it. And so as a result, it's still valid in that sense, but nonetheless, it still has some limitations as well.
Okay, thank you very much for that interesting presentation.
I see one more question there. Cost barriers. How do we overcome the cost barriers? Cost barriers from the government standpoint. Well, now is the worst time given what COVID has done to the world over, but it may also be the best time. Trinidad and Tobago in particular is poised for this transformation. And so if it is that they look at getting international funding because it ties in with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So there's money in the space there. In Trinidad, there's also a green fund. So if research and things of this nature were to tap into that green fund, the money would be able to draw in to make this transition that's needed as well.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ellis, for your nice presentation. Great to hear from you on very authentic topics, and also favorite for me also. Thank you. We'll talk